In an eerily anticipatory echo of Hobbes, Marsilius claims that the basic task of government is to be a defender of the peace. Because he, that is man, is born naked and undefended against the excesses of the air which surrounds him and of the other elements, therefore he stood in need of arts of different kinds and types in order to resist the said damage. And since these arts could not be practiced except by a large number of men, nor retained except by their mutual communication, men need to gather together to secure the advantage to be had from them and to avoid disadvantage. But because disputes and scuffles break out among men who are gathered together in this way, and these, were they not regulated by a norm of justice, would cause fighting, the separation of men, and ultimately the destruction of the city, it was necessary to institute within this community a standard of justice and a guardian and executor of it. Peace is the basic reason for which government exists, and the condition without which no one can obtain a sufficient life. Peace, for Marsilio, writes Nederman, is not an end in itself, but a requirement for the realization of stable intercourse within the community, towards the end of a materially sufficient life. Whatever threatens the peace is necessarily inconsistent with the natural and proper goal of human society. The tranquility of the city can be disturbed from without or within. Outside considerations, such as bad weather or natural disasters, can affect the political community's ability to provide a sufficiency. The internal considerations, however, are the human passions that issue in actions that affect others for good or for ill. Employing again a medical metaphor, Marsilius conceives of some human actions as proceeding from an excess that, if not restrained, can lead to conflict and the consequent destruction of the political community. The cure for such excess is the restoration of some kind of balance. Marsilius writes, "There are other actions and passions, however, which come from us or occur within us, as a result of our cognitive and appetitive powers. Some of these are called immanent, that is, because they do not cross over into a subject different from the agent, nor are they performed by means of an external organ or limb moved in a respective place. Such are the thoughts and desires and inclinations of men. Whereas others are and are called transitive, because in one or other of the said ways they are in contrast with those just mentioned. Transitive actions may cause inconvenience or injury to others. In order to moderate excesses arising from some of these transitive actions, there was of necessity instituted within the city a particular part or office through which the excesses of such acts might be corrected and reduced to equality or due proportion. As a student of medicine, it is understandable that Marsilius uses the metaphor of health and sickness in his evaluation of political regimes. Just as a body can be healthy or diseased, so too can a city. A body will be unhealthy if its constituent parts compete with each other instead of cooperating. So too with the city. The health of a body is the cooperation of all its organs. The health of a city is tranquility. In line with Aristotle's distinction between good polities and bad polities, Marsilius thinks of temperate or healthy government as government for the good of all, intemperate or unhealthy government as that which is good only for some of the parts. In order to illustrate what tranquility and its opposition is, he imagines that the city is like a kind of animate or animal nature. For the animal which is in good condition in respect of its nature is composed of certain proportionate parts, arranged in respect of each other, all communicating their action between themselves and towards the whole. Likewise, too, the city which is in good condition and established in accordance with reason is made up of certain such parts. A city and its parts would therefore seem to be in the same relation to tranquility as an animal and its parts is to health. A somewhat less metaphorical and less picturesque definition of tranquillity is that it is the good condition of a city or realm in which each of its parts is enabled perfectly to perform the operations appropriate to it according to reason and the way it has been established. Marsilius's sharp division between the spiritual and the secular is applied to law. Although on the surface it appears multifaceted, in the end, Marsilius's division of law reduces to a simple bifurcation. We have divine law and we have human law. Both forms of law are presented as the outcomes of commands, the one the result of a divine command, the other the result of a human command. Both forms of law have content, but only human law is coercible in this world. In this, as in other matters, Marsilius's thought differs fundamentally from that of Thomas Aquinas. For Thomas, all law was understood to be essentially the same kind of thing, albeit it had to be understood analogously, cascading downwards, as it were, from eternal law through divine law to natural law and human law. For Marsilius, on the other hand, divine law and human law are essentially different. Moreover, for Thomas, law was an ordinance of reason consonant with the natures of those subject to it, and not simply an expression of a legislator's will. Whereas for Marsilius, law is essentially a command, an expression of the will of the legislator, the disobeying of which will attract a penal sanction. Alexander Dontrave identifies the dependence of the whole body politic on the will of the legislator as the novelty of Marsilius's system. I'm not quite so sure it's the novelty Dontrave thinks it is. Cicero, one of Marsilius's sources, had remarked that as the magistrate is under the law, so too the people are under the magistrate. Cicero writes, "As magistrates are subject to laws, the people are subject to the magistrates. In fact, it is true to say that a magistrate is a speaking law, and law a silent magistrate." All that's missing to square Cicero with Marsilius is to have the people be the source of law, and that's precisely the direction in which Marsilius goes. God is obviously the legislator in the case of divine law. Who is the legislator of human law? Ideally, the whole body of the people, but where that's not possible, and it isn't often going to be possible, the weightier part of the community, what Marsilius calls the valentier pars. Determining who this weightier part is more a qualitative than a quantitative matter. In any political community, there will be those, usually those few, who are best placed and best circumstanced to declare the law. In Marsilius's city-state, those would be the oligarchs of the city. Who was to play this role in the various kingdoms and principalities of the Holy Roman Empire? It's not so easy for Marsilius to answer this question. The legislator is the primary and proper efficient cause of the law, he says, the people or the universal body of the citizens, or else its prevailing part, when, by means of an election or will expressed in speech in the General Assembly of the citizens, it commands or determines, subject to temporal penalty or punishment, that something should be done or omitted in respect of human civil acts. The body of the people or its prevailing part give effect to their will in a General Assembly, operating according to a set of rules. Human lawmaking, then, requires something akin to an executive body whose authority derives ultimately from all the people. Law, supported by such authority, may not only be made in a formal assembly, but can also be expressed through generally accepted custom. Wisdom is the cumulative possession of a community, not the inspiration of some particularly inspired person. Marsilius thinks of knowledge as something that is gradually accumulated, so that at the start of an inquiry we have at best a partial and limited grasp of reality. Understanding requires a community and is a function of a common history. There will be those in the community who are above average in their grasp and understanding of political matters, but they are not and cannot be the only judges of what is good or bad. If the prince were to act as legislator, he would lack the communal wisdom of the whole body of citizens. Think of Hayek's dispersed knowledge in this connection, and would be susceptible to partiality in respect of himself and his family and his own interests. In Defensor Pacis, Marsilius positioned the people as the legislator, but he appears to be somewhat ambiguous as to who constitutes the people in this context. Should the people be understood narrowly or broadly, inclusively or exclusively? Are artisans and workmen to be included in this body or not? Morrell thinks that the volunteer powers comprises the vast majority of the community, the normal, undeformed citizens. In their persons, the claims of both quality and quantity are reconciled. The Defensor Minor appears to clarify this point. Marsilius writes, "The power and authority to correct rulers who are negligent or irresponsible in performing their duties by restraining them through punishment of their persons or property belongs solely to the human legislator. If such correction pertains to some particular part or office of the civic body, then under no circumstances does it pertain to the priests, but instead to the men of prudence or learned teachers, indeed preferably to the workmen or craftsmen or the rest of the labourers." Naderman takes this passage to indicate that the task of correction should be given for preference to workmen and artisans rather than to men of prudence or learned teachers. However, the passage is ambiguous, and I think it is more likely that Marsilius is counselling that the task of correction be given not to priests, but to men of prudence and learned teachers, in preference to the workmen or craftsmen. This would correspond to what he says explicitly in Defensor Pacis. There he writes, "It is the province of any citizen to discover the content of the law, even if this kind of inquiry can more appropriately be undertaken and more adequately completed through the observations of those who have the possibility of leisure, elders, and those experienced in action who are called the prudent, than through the cogitations of mechanical workers who must concentrate on their labours in order to acquire the necessities of life." The rival authorities and legal structures prevalent in the Middle Ages could, and did, give rise to situations in which rival claims conflicted and were capable of being arbitrated differently. Often, of course, agreement was possible, or one or other side would concede, but sometimes agreement wasn't possible, and neither side would give way. When the two competing sides were the regnum and the sacerdotium, specifically the empire and the papacy, trouble was bound to ensue. Both laid claims to men's allegiance, both could claim divine support, both had means at their disposal to cause trouble for the other, but in the end each had need of the other. For Marsilius, good government is government by law, not force. Good law should be clear and knowable, and it should really be law, not just force masquerading as law. So, what makes law to be law? One thing on which all the medievals were agreed, though their working out of that agreement was a contentious matter, was that the law was not something that could, still less ought to be, made. To think otherwise, writes MacLelland, that human beings really could make law was to take a position with potentially very radical implications. Until very recently, the task of the judge in common law systems in cases not readily subsumable under existing legal rules was to find the law, the assumption being that the law governing this particular case was there to be found, just that the occasion for finding it had not yet arisen. It cannot be too much emphasized that the idea that it is the task of a specific body to make law, as distinct from codifying, clarifying, or synthesizing aboriginal law, is a very new and a very revolutionary idea. Despite its novelty and its revolutionary character, the idea of law as the product of a legislature is now the dominant conception of what law is in Western societies. MacLelland remarks that it's not clear when men in the West began to believe that they could truly make new law. The distinction between law declarer and lawmaker was still alive and well at the end of the 18th century. Marsilius's ideas have often been taken to presage a theory of consent of the governed, and it's easy to see why. All those whose interests are determined in any way by a community must be granted full membership of that community. In Roman law there was a maxim that what touches or concerns all similarly should be approved by all. So Marsilius gives the following argument. Either the legislator is all, one, or a few. If one, the distorting effects of passion and self-interest might induce him to pass a bad law. Similarly with a few. He continues, it belongs therefore to the universal body of the citizens or its prevailing part, where the reasoning is different and contrasting. For because all the citizens must be measured by a law in due proportion, and no one willingly harms or wants what is unjust for himself, therefore all or most of them want a law that is adapted to the common advantage of the citizens. This passage gives two reasons why the legislator should be the citizen body as a whole. The first is that by having all give their approval, it irons out the idiosyncrasies that might well result from the laws being made by one or a few. Secondly, since the law that is made by me will apply to me, and that's the case for all citizens, then it's more likely to be made for the advantages of all than otherwise. But, it might be objected, there is as good a chance of the voice of the people being vox diaboli as being vox Dei. What then? A political community can only come into being if the majority of its citizens are willing to support it and engage with it in such a way that it is truly productive of its efficiency. That being so, citizens in the plural are neither wicked nor undiscerning, at least in respect of most individuals and most of the time. All or most are of sound mind and reason and of an upright desire for the polity and what is necessary for its survival, such as laws and other statutes or customs, as shown before. For although not every citizen, nor the greater multitude, may discover the laws, every citizen is nonetheless capable of a judgment on those which have been discovered and put to him by another, and of perceiving if something should be added or removed or changed. Secondly, even if we have among us those who are wise, it doesn't follow that the wise know how to discern what needs to be established better than the entire multitude, which includes them along with the rest of the less learned. As members of a community, individuals must agree to the terms constituting this community, the laws by which it is to be regulated, and the executive principles by which it is to be governed. Once consent is given, individuals are bound to obey the law and the decisions made by the rulers of the community in conformity with those laws. This account is of particular interest to libertarians inasmuch as it makes the legitimacy of the community a voluntary matter. A regime is well-tempered, Marsilius thinks, to the degree that it is exercised over willing subjects and in accordance with the law passed for the common advantage of these subjects. And laws must receive their necessary approval from the same primary authority, the universal body of the citizens, or its prevailing part, and no other. Participation in the political life of the community, therefore, is, for Marsilius, real and not nominal, and even if citizens in the street are not expected to devote themselves full-time to political matters, it is appropriate and expedient for them to delegate this task to prudent and experienced men. The legitimacy of any government, then, depends upon the voluntary assent of those over whom government is to be exercised. Once one has assented to a law, one cannot thereafter object to its enforcement. Marsilius writes, "But every citizen would happily obey and accept a law passed as a result of an audience or consent on the part of all the multitude, in that with a law of this kind each can be seen to have laid it upon himself, and therefore has no cause to protest against it, but rather to accept it with equanimity." This idea of legal obligation resulting from the imposition of a law on oneself will echo through the succeeding centuries, resonating in such different thinkers as Rousseau and Kant and Hegel. Marsilius's account of the popular basis of sovereignty can be made to sound radical and forward-looking, but its effect is to strengthen, not weaken, the authority of the secular rulers of the political community. To describe the people as the source of political sovereignty is not at all the same thing as to say that the people should exercise political sovereignty. Marsilius was no democrat, as that term is understood in the contemporary world, and there was enough of Augustine in him to think that sinful men required a firm hand otherwise the peace would be disturbed. Despite all this, the omens for freedom in Marsilius' world are anything but propitious. Whereas before Marsilius, the sacerdotium and the regnum worked together to restrain and repress the selfish, disruptive tendencies of men. With the coercive power of the spiritual authority removed, the whole task of repressing and restraining men now falls on the shoulders of the secular rulers. And there is nothing to prevent secular rulers requiring a stricter and more rigidly enforced obedience to secular law than obtained in the competing and conflicting multiple authorities of the medieval world. Furthermore, whereas in the pre-Marsilian world there existed the possibility of playing one coercive authority off against the other, in the Marsilian world that possibility no longer exists. In the Defensor Minor, Marsilius, disappointingly from a libertarian perspective, remarks that divine law commands obedience to human rulers and laws which are not contrary to divine law. There can be no doubt that Marsilius desires the freedom of every citizen. He writes, "Any and every citizen should be free and not suffer the despotism of another. But this would not be the case if some one or few of the citizens passed law upon the universal body of the citizens on their own authority, for in legislating in this way they would be despots over the others." What's not so clear is why Marsilius desires the freedom of every citizen. In the end, Marsilius appears to have no fully developed theory of freedom. It seems that just as the matter of the virtuous life, while not rejected, is deferred by Marsilius, so too is the ultimate value of freedom.